I don't wanna grow up, I'm a curious kid. The world has 100 questions I can play with. So I'll open my arms and eyes and wonder every day till the day I die. No one really knows why gravity exists.
Dr. Eileen Lacey is professor in the Department of Integrative Biology at UC Berkeley. She leads the Lacey Lab, of course, at Cal, as well as the Vertebrate Social Behavior and Population Biology Lab at Cal's Museum of Vertebrate Zoology. Eileen earned her undergraduate biology degree at Cornell, and then she went on to earn master's and PhD degrees at Michigan. Did I get that right? University of Michigan, sorry. Of her many published works, one full book particularly caught my eye. I was reminded of my favorite and perhaps most profound college reading assignment. It was Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground. Dr. Lacey's book is entitled Life Underground, The Biology of Subterranean Rodents. Please join me in welcoming behavioral biologist, more insightful in important ways than even Dostoevsky, Dr. Eileen Lacey.
Thanks, Tucker. I'm not sure I agree with that, but we'll see. I thought you were going to mention another book that I'll mention here. Yeah, but anyway, thanks to everyone for turning out tonight. I know we're kind of getting back in the routine and starting to get out and do things again. And I'll confess this is my first live public talk in a while, so hopefully I'm not too rusty. And if everybody's okay, I took my mask off just because I think you'll understand me better, but I appreciate everybody being careful and attentive to that. All right, so as Tucker mentioned, I'm a behavioral biologist, and I'm based over in the Museum of Vertebrate Zoology in the Department of Integrative Biology over at Berkeley. And what I'd like to do tonight is share with you some of the things that I've learned over the course of my career. Some of these are trade secrets about how we study animal behavior, and others are observations and results that we've obtained regarding the behavior of some of my favorite rodents, a group of South American rodents called tuco-tucos, includes this guy here. I want it to be fun, informal, and hopefully informative, but more just get people excited about the kind of things that I'm excited about. That's my largest goal. So the first thing I'll mention is no secret, and that is animal behavior is amazing. I think all of us share, almost everybody I've ever talked with shares an interest in just understanding what animals are doing. And I look at these photos, and what I see is a whole series of stories. I want to know why that animal's doing that, why a particular behavior has taken the form it has over evolutionary time, why it's often associated with specialized morphological features or colors. I look at that and I want to know what each of those animals is doing and why. I think probably a lot of you share that same general interest. At the same time, I think animal behavior is important. It's not just the gee whiz and let's appreciate these things, but I think animal behavior is important. I'll ask, it's a little hard to see. Do we have any MDs in the room, any physicians? No? Well, I think you'll still understand the point. Think about every time you go talk to your physician. I know whenever I go to Kaiser, think about how many human health problems have connections to behavior, either as the remedy or the symptom. Same thing, a lot of human mental illnesses that we deal with either manifest behaviorally or behavior might be part of the solution. The point I'm trying to make is that even though I study animals like this that are not humans, and I work more in the context of, say, evolutionary biology, climate change, things like that, the things that we're learning from animals like this have potential importance to understanding ourselves and understanding our own species. So I would argue animal behavior is important, and for all the reasons I just mentioned. I know every time I go to Kaiser, the first thing my physician says, eat less, exercise more. Both of those are forms of behavior, right? We certainly know how much human social behavior, human contact, can influence how we feel, both creating stress, creating distress, and at times helping to relieve it. And we're just finishing up a 2-year period in which the role of social behavior in human health has been displayed in a way it never has before in our lifetimes. Everything from masking, not masking, interacting in crowds, all of those things are aspects of human behavior that have had implications, very important implications over the last couple of years. So the point I'd like to make, and I've probably overmade it, is that even though I'll be talking about non-human animals tonight, I think a lot of the things that I and my colleagues are learning have relevance to understanding our own behavior and the implications of our own behavior. But that said, I study rodents. I study wild rodents. And to me, I'm just amazed every day I wake up. I get paid to watch animals. I mean, how better could life be, right? And so what I'd like to share with you tonight are, again, some of my experiences studying wild populations of non-humans, and both talk a little bit about how we do that and some of the things that I've learned along the way. Well, just to give you a little bit of background, for me, it all started with naked mole rats. When I was an undergrad at Cornell back in the Pleistocene, I just happened to stumble into a lab that had some of the first naked mole rats in the US. And I spent my undergraduate career in hot, dark rooms watching these rodents do things. By now, everybody's heard about naked mole rats and knows that they have this incredible social system. They live like honeybees, right? It's a group, but even if there are 200 mole rats living together, there's one female that produces all the offspring. She has a couple of consorts, and all the rest of the animals are non-reproductive. Everybody knows that now, but at the time, that's what we were in the process of describing. So all those hours in a hot, dark room watching these animals do things, the outcome was to describe that pattern of social behavior, or that social structure. This is the book I thought Tucker was going to mention, that some of my undergraduate work ended up in the mole rat book, and I thought that was going to be the claim to fame, but no. But in any event, this is how I got started and really got captivated by studying animals and studying wild animals. But about the time I was finishing up as an undergrad and starting to think about next steps in graduate school, combination of factors. One is, by that time, naked mole rats had caught on and become very popular, kind of a little bit too popular if you ask me. There are cartoons, their own magazine, kids' books. Darwin apparently had a pet mole rat, and my favorite, the mole rat soap in the lower right corner. I've never found it. If anyone ever finds a bar, please buy one for me. But combination, everybody was on to mole rats. And combination that, okay, it'd been really cool working with those animals, but this is where I wanted to be. I wanted to be outdoors working with wild animals. I started thinking about other possibilities. What other animals could I study, maybe to ask some of the same questions? Why live in groups? Why be social? Why be extremely social? I focused my search on other subterranean rodents, the rationale being living underground in burrows constrains life, constrains natural history in ways that might help the search for similar or convergent examples of sociality in different lineages of rodents. So I was looking for an independent evolutionary origin for group living in a subterranean rodent. There weren't a lot of options. Subterranean rodents occur on almost every continent, worldwide in distribution, but the dogma has always been they're solitary. Every adult lives alone. They can't live together. At the time I was looking for an alternative example, the lineages, the evolutionary lineages of subterranean rodents that we knew about that might contain something interesting, meaning a social species, well, there were the naked mole rats, but I was trying to move away from them. The other two options were two lineages of rodents from South America. One, the one over, and I guess, get the right direction, you're right, is a thing called a caruru. That was one option. They live in Chile. The other was a species of tuco-tuco. Now, for reasons I'll explain in a few moments regarding potential comparative studies within lineages as well as across them, I opted to go with the tuko-tucos. Now, this leads us to secret number one for the night. What's a tuco-tuco? Now, depending on who you ask, answers differ. For those of us of a certain generation, Eli Wallach may come to mind. For the somewhat younger crowd, I think they first think of Breaking Bad. Turns out in Argentina, where I've done a lot of field work, tuco is the name given to the basic tomato pasta sauce. And so there's that. But then, of course, we're talking about the rodent there in the lower, I guess, right corner. And I'll say more about them in a second. So you now know more about what a tuco-tuco is than the vast majority of people on the planet. So secret number one. Give you a little bit of natural history about tuco-tucos. They belong to the rodent family Tenomyidae. It's a South American family distributed south of the Amazon basin down to Tierra del Fuego, and from the Andes east to the Atlantic coast, the area hatched in red and yellow there. They're replaced in Chile by the caruru, the other rodent I mentioned. Within this family, there's only one genus, the genus Tenomys, but it's an incredibly speciose genus containing currently more than 60 species, and we keep describing more. So one genus, lots of species all throughout that hatched area. All of them are subterranean. They all live underground. And associated with that, you look at the pictures there, those are all different species of tuco-tucos, and you're probably wondering, because the joke is kind of, you've seen one, you've seen them all. They're all very similar in body plan and general life history. Part of that seems to be adaptations to living underground because they all live in burrows. The other is this is a relatively recently evolved lineage. They've speciated rapidly and recently, and so perhaps also haven't had a lot of time to differentiate. But a little bit of natural history there about tuco-tucos. The star for tonight is this tuco-tuco, the colonial tuco-tuco. I love this photo. This was taken by a former student who's now a professional National Geographic photographer. I didn't take this photo, but the sun glinting, it looks like a star. I've been focused on this species for quite a while now. The reason being, when I was starting to work with tuco-tucos, this was the one species of tuco-tuco that people thought might be social, might be doing something interesting behaviorally that would make it worth comparing with those naked mole rats. Just to give you a little natural history for this species, it was described in 1985, so not that long ago really, by a former colleague of mine over at Berkeley, Oliver Pearson. Pearson was a real character. He'd spent 70 years trekking around South America just studying things and identifying them. And he discovered this particular species of tuco-tuco, and he was an astute natural historian, so he immediately saw it was doing something different. In particular, he reported it was one line in a very brief paper in Spanish. If you watched these animals, you could see multiple individuals popping out of the same burrow entrance. Well, that certainly didn't fit with being solitary, and it certainly piqued my curiosity, and I started thinking, yeah, that's what I want to study. Well, it turns out part of the biology of this species is it's a very restricted endemic and occurs in a tiny little area. It's about 1,500 square kilometers, the red hatched area in the map there, in Argentine Patagonia. So I don't know if anyone here ever been to Patagonia? No? Been to Bariloche in particular? Oh, you all need to go. As a reference point, the black dot down on the bottom of the map is the city of San Carlos de Bariloche. Its primary source of income is fine chocolates. The main street downtown is just redolent of chocolate. It's amazing. It's also home to the colonial tuco-tuco, but nobody believes me when I say I went there for the animals. But as I was saying, this species is endemic to just this one tiny little area just north of Bariloche. It's all national park land. It's Argentina's flagship national park, but they didn't know they had this animal until 1985. Well, that pretty much determined where I had to go to study these guys, so I packed up, not knowing any Spanish at the time, not knowing where I was going, arranged to meet a local Argentine student in San Carlos de Bariloche, got there, and I've been going every year ever since. I won't mention how long, but it's been longer than most of my lab group has been alive, so I won't leave it out. All right. We set up a long-term study site, the bigger black dot there, right on the western shore of the river you see flowing up to the upper right there is the Rio Limay. We set up a long-term study site right on the western shore of the Limay. The photo over here You can see a shot of the valley, the river valley. It's a little hard to see, but you see the vast open space of green. That's where the tuco-tucos are. And then up towards the bottom here, you see the 2 yellow dots there? Those are our tents. That's our field camp. It was amazing. Roll out of bed in the morning, walk a short distance, there we are, go to work, study colonial tuco-tucos. A little tech support here, okay? And so that's been a focus of my research for a long time now. Now, when I started this project, this is what I envisioned my life would be like, okay? And take a second to... How Larson got that so perfect, I don't know. But, you know, obviously he was channeling me, right? But yeah. That's what I envisioned my field program would be like and what I'd be doing to study behavior. Thanks. And in truth, a lot of it has been pretty much like that. But there's another side to it, and in terms of trying to explain to people how we study behavior of wild animals, it took me a while to hit on the right explanation. I was talking to a woman one day who lived near the study site trying to explain what it would do, and she said, oh, what you do is just like watching an episode of Dynasty. Now you can update to your appropriate soap opera, but she pretty much nailed it. That is what this consists of. That basically I'm trying to document who did what to whom and figure out why. So, yes, I'm dating myself again with the Dynasty reference, but you get the idea. The critical point that emerges from that idea or that kind of light bulb moment is that a very important part of studying wild animals is we need to know who's who. We need to follow known individuals to follow the soap opera of their lives, right? If we can do that, if we can follow known individuals, we can get all kinds of insights into things like the effects of behavior on survival, on reproduction, on physiology, and increasingly on gene expression and how genes are functioning. So I'll add a little note here, just a little ethical caveat, that all of the work that we do, and I'm including behavioral biologists like myself, all of the work we do is carefully regulated by federal guidelines, certainly when working with vertebrates. So everything I'm going to describe to you is approved as, you know, appropriate, humane, not harmful to the animals. That's also consistent with we want our animals healthy and alive and behaving normally. So I'm not going to say anything horrible, but people always want to know. And so just to reassure everyone that not only is all of this reviewed very carefully by ethics boards, but the whole goal is to keep those animals doing what they should be doing. So just a little side note there. I guess I'm bound to. I'm chair of Berkeley's Animal Care Use Committee, or was until very recently, so that's my plug for them. All right. So the point is we want to be able to follow known individuals and follow the soap operas of their lives. This leads us to secret number 2, which is how to figure out who's who. So you look at this nice bait ball of fish here, right? And that looks pretty cool just as it is. You're like, what are those fish doing? How do they coordinate those movements? You know, how is all of that working out? But as soon as we can start to identify specific individuals in that bait ball, everything changes. And there's a little snickering going on over here because I want to introduce, let's see, we'll go around that Aaron is sitting here, Lawrence, Quasi, and Daisy. Shannon's out of town, but I had to get... So in any event, that's who's named there. But the point is, as soon as we know an animal is an individual, it totally changes what we can do and how we identify with them and how we understand their lives. So how do we do that? How do we figure out who's who? Well, some species come pre-marked, which is convenient. These African wild dogs have unique spotting patterns on their legs in particular, and we can use that to tell who's who. We often take a reference photo as a permanent record of the spotting pattern of each individual, but we don't need to do anything with the animal. They're good to go. But as you can easily imagine, a lot of other species aren't quite so accommodating. I look at those worker honeybees, I couldn't tell you who's who. So in that case, I would have to do something as a researcher to mark individuals to be able to follow them. So how do we mark animals? Well, again, in some cases it can be done pretty readily in situ. Those are some of our local Northern California elephant seals. If you're fast, you can run up and basically graffiti an elephant seal and then it's marked for behavioral observations, and then probably even faster run away, right? Although that one doesn't look too perturbed. So some animals make it pretty easy, but I'd say the vast majority of species, again, are not quite so accommodating. So that means we need to get our hands on them. We need to catch an animal to be able to mark it, to follow known individuals, and go on with this idea of the soap opera. Well, this leads me to secret number 3, and back to my work, how to catch a colonial tuco-tuco. I don't see, there was supposed to be one plant in the audience. I don't think she got here. Has anyone in the audience ever caught a colonial tuco-tuco? Yeah, she didn't make it. Okay. Darn, it was her moment. I'll never let her live it down. Any event, here's what we do. And I thought Julie Woodruff, who's shown here, was going to be here tonight, but here she is catching colonial tuco-tucos. And I don't know if you can figure out here quite what she's got, but here's the tuco's burrow entrance, and she's got basically a long shoelace running from the burrow entrance back to her hand. We tried all kinds of things. The only thing that works to catch colonial tuco-tucos is to noose them by hand. Now, I'm convinced every species, there's a secret to every species, and for colonial tuco-tucos, after 5 or 6 years, we figured out this was the secret. You may ask why we stuck it out that long trying. That's another story, but we did, and we arrived at this solution. So the single most important piece of research equipment that I own, and I thought I brought one tonight, but I couldn't find it in my backpack, is that piece of nylon cord purchased at REI. Okay? It's about $1.98 worth of cord is the single most important thing I have. The reason it works, tell you a little bit more about colonial tuco-tucos. When the animals emerge, this species, when it emerges to forage, it's going to eat vegetation growing on the surface. When it emerges to forage, it never comes out more than half a body length. You wouldn't know these things had hind legs, just from watching them in the field. When they come up, they plant their front legs on the edge of the burrow, and you've got a few seconds there where they're kind of looking around, letting their eyes adjust. That's the window of opportunity. So what we do is we get up in the morning, we first identify which burrows are being used that day. We do that by putting a little stick or blade of grass across the burrow entrance and going back and checking several times. And where the burrow entrance or that grass gets knocked aside consistently, we know that's where the animal is, or where it's eating that day. We then carefully set up our noose. And now I'll ask the question again. Has anybody in this room ever caught a colonial tuco-tuco?
I have.
You made it. You just missed your cue, Julie.
Yeah, those students kept working. I just couldn't get out of it.
This is Dr. Julie Woodruff, who got her PhD with me and now teaches both at Santa Rosa JC and over at Berkeley. And so she was my plant. She has caught colonial tuco-tucos. Oops. So sorry, back to the method. We identify the burrow entrance being used. We then put the noose in very carefully. It's an art form. And then we sit and wait. And we sit and we wait. And we sit and we wait. It's a great time to meditate, to watch the sky, to watch the rest of the wildlife in the area, but it does take a while. And then when the tuco finally decides to come up, it comes up, plants its feet, you pull the noose. Because the noose is soft and stretchy, it doesn't hurt the animal. It just catches them right here so they can't pull back down into their burrow. And then you pick them up with the other hand. Kind of crazy. It's an esoteric skill, I admit, but we've used it to catch now several thousand colonial tuco-tucos. So, secret number 3, not that any of you will ever need to use this in your lifetimes, but that's how you catch a colonial tuco-tuco. Once we get our hands on them, things are a little bit more routine. We mark each individual first with a pit tag. This is just like the chips that now everyone's putting in their pet cats and dogs, right? And that's a permanent ID that we can identify that animal for the rest of its lifetime. Depending on what we're doing and the questions we're trying to address, we may also give them some visual markings so we can identify when that head pops out who's who just based on looking at them. We use all the great human hair colors that the undergrads are rocking these days. It works out really well. And you can see it's all concentrated in the front end, so when the animal pops out, all we see is the head. We can identify red cheeks. that's all pretty standard for small mammal work. The final piece of technology, or the final marking method that's really been the core of the program, is to give it, all the adults anyway, a radio collar. You can see the little transmitter pack there and little collar around that animal's neck. If we do that, each of those little radios emits a VHS pulse at a different frequency. We can then use a scanner and an antenna to walk around and find animals underground based on their radio collars. So when we do that, we collar the animal, let it go, it goes on about its life, and then we spend a lot of time walking around on a regular schedule figuring out where every animal is. Those spatial data are really critical. They tell us who's hanging out with whom. If we collect enough of those spatial data, we can quantitatively map out each of these weird little polygons is the home range, the area occupied by one tuco-tuco. And even just looking at that, you can immediately tell, hey, that animal lives alone, but here there's a cluster of 3 of them. So the telemetry data really gives us a lot of information. Pretty simple, pretty straightforward. That's all pretty standard field methodology for animals. What have we learned using it? Again, all we've really done is identify individual tuco-tucos and then follow where they are spatially using the telemetry. Question, Ann?
Do you mind questions during your...
No, go ahead. It's your, yeah.
I understand the map, I think, at lower right.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a depth factor? Are all tuco-tucos at the same depth, or can there be basement tuco-tucos?
Good question. Kind of asking about the third dimension there. The habitats where these animals live, they really tend to be restricted more or less to 2 dimensions. I mean, there's a little bit of depth, that most of those tunnels are maybe half a meter below the surface. And so there's the difference between running around down there and coming up to the surface. But there's not really a lot of third dimension usually, yeah. And in fact, little anecdote, these guys are horrible at detecting the third dimension. If I had a live tuco here and put it on the table, you know, most rodents would walk to the edge of the table and kind of pause, and they'll just plop right off. They don't understand the third dimension. So, yeah. Okay, great question, though. Okay, so now, again, all we've really done is mark individual animals and follow them to figure out where they are in space. What have we learned? And I should preface this by saying when I started, we knew nothing about the behavior of this species, really. We had the hints from Oliver Pearson that they might be living in groups, but that was it. We had no real data. Well, the first thing we learned is, yeah, indeed, they live in groups. Well, that was a relief, right? After all that work catching them and all that, it would have been a bummer to find out that they're solitary. Little bit of data, relax. There's no quiz at the end of the talk. You can just kind of pick up the bottom line message here, but show you a little information. The point being, we gather all these data using those really simple methods I just talked about. Here I've just plotted how many adult females there are per burrow system. And you can see it ranges from, at this point in time, 1 to 6 females living together in the same burrow system. And about half of those burrow systems also contain an adult male. So we do all of our field work during the annual breeding season. These animals breed once a year, and we go down when they're younger around so that we can mark them and identify them while they're still living with their parents. So the absence of males is just, it's tough to be a male. And by that point in the breeding season, a lot of them have already, due to competition, fighting with each other, things like that. So, but definitely, yes, they're social, and that was a relief to discover that. Using the same data, we've started to understand a little about the structure of those groups. One is by following individuals now from year to year. In particular, animals that we first catch when they're juveniles, come back and catch them a year later as adults and compare where they were, we can start to look at individual patterns of dispersal. The cartoon here just shows you each little gray oval is a different burrow system, cartoon of a burrow system, and the arrows are just connecting. For example, this animal was born here, ended up moving over and setting up as an adult over here. It's just tracing the dispersal movements of different individuals to give you a sense of what it looks like. Getting a little more quantitative, all males leave home. Well, I guess almost all males. There always has to be that one exception, right? But in reality, all juvenile males leave home and go live elsewhere as adults. In contrast, females, it's a split. And in fact, the majority of females that we recapture as adults are still living in their natal burrow system, the natal burrow system where they were born, often still living with their mom or their aunts or females who were around the year before. Well, that's interesting. It's also pretty important because what it tells us, putting this all together, is that those groups of colonial tuco-tucos, the females that live together, are all closely related to each other, and the male is coming in from somewhere else. Well, kinship is really important at understanding a lot of aspects of social behavior. For example, all behavioral biology theory predicts you should be more likely to be amicable, to cooperate with animals you're related to compared to animals you're not related to. So that was an important piece of information, again, just based on those same simple methods. If we dig into that a little bit more and look at individual females, what we discovered is there's one point in a female's life when she has to make a decision, so to speak, about whether to disperse or not. So everybody's born in the spring in a burrow system, and at the end of that first summer, so when a female's about 4 months old, if she's going to disperse, that's the only time in her life that she'll disperse. So some females do disperse. If they do, they have to find an empty burrow system. A dispersing female never joins another group. She has to find an empty burrow system and set up shop there, and that's where she'll live the first time that she breeds and produces offspring when she's 1 year old. I mean, she'll have a male. There's a male involved. It's not that amazing. But she doesn't have any other female kin with her. In contrast, the females that stay home, that are philopatric, when they're the same age and breeding for the first time, they're doing that surrounded by other female kin. So a very different social environment. And we were intrigued once we realized that's what was going on, and that's kind of how we linked up dispersing, not dispersing for females. We became really interested in comparing or trying to assess some of the costs and benefits of being alone versus being with your female kin during that first year as a breeding animal. Afterwards, things kind of equalized because the females that were alone the first year recruit their daughters and end up in groups. So it's really that first year as a breeder that matters. And again, just based on trapping and spatial data, what we found is, first of all, those lone females, the ones that disperse, that first year, they have more offspring than a female that lives in a group. Well, that seems kind of counterintuitive in a lot of ways. We think we're starting to understand why, but the pattern definitely exists. So, okay, you disperse, you find that empty burrow system, you're going to have more kids. That sounds good. Certainly sounds good from an evolutionary perspective. But there's a trade-off. If we then look at survival from that first breeding season to the next breeding season, the lone animals aren't as likely to survive long enough to be around to have a second crop of offspring. So there's a trade-off going on there that very much is tied to, again, whether you dispersed or not and whether you live with female kin or not the first time you breed. Okay, that's pretty cool, and that's given us a lot of food for thought, and we've done a lot of other things to try and understand that, but that was a really important pattern to understand in trying to assess, should I disperse, should I stay home, what the relative costs and benefits are. Question, yeah?
Is there a particular factor in body weight or size of the ones that disperse versus the ones that don't?
That's exactly what we're working on right now. Just, yeah, no, both in the field, when we get back to the field, we've been disrupted a little bit now for the obvious reason. And full disclosure, I have a colony of these things over in Berkeley, and we're pairing it with captive observation. That is exactly where we're going. So,
I didn't mean to.
No, that's great. I love it. I love it because you're right on point. That's exactly where, yeah.
I'll wait for the information.
Well, we'll see. See if I get around to answering your question. But that's exactly what we're working on right now, is trying to understand on a more proximate level, like, is it differences in body weight? Is it differences in, I don't know, some just straight up difference in how exploratory you are, how bold you are and willing to take off? Absolutely what we're looking at right now. Where I was going to go from here, that's great. Please do ask questions. I'm not trying to discourage you. was to wrap this back now a little bit to the environment, because you're kind of think, okay, this is all great and interesting and cool, but why stay home? Why is this pattern even happening? And it turns out that seems to be driven by the environment. But again, no one knew anything when we started, but as we began working more with these animals and did a lot of hiking in the area in Patagonia where they occur, it quickly became apparent that they're pretty specialized in terms of the habitat they use. This is right at the base, eastern base of the Andes. The dominant habitat in the area is steppe, so open, dry grassland. You can kind of see bunches of, various bunch grasses and things. Scattered here and there are wetter patches where the water collects, the soil is much richer, and the vegetation is very different. The Argentines have a term for that. Their term is magine. We would say seep or maybe wet meadow. But what we discovered is these colonial tuco-tucos are restricted just kind of to the border of those wetter patches. They can't go too far in because it's too wet, but they stick pretty tight to that border. The distribution of that habitat is cartooned here. It's pretty scattered, pretty hit or miss, and thinking from the perspective of a dispersing colonial tuco-tuco, the odds that you might find a place where you could live, if you leave home, finding a place to live is probably pretty tough and unpredictable. Now, all of this fits with a lot of classic behavioral biology theories suggesting that under conditions like this, a lot of animals may stay home. That's the safer thing to do. So just to kind of wrap up where we've been so far, again, just based on these very simple methods of knowing who's who and following them, we've gone, or we can start to link together what the habitat's like, how we think that might impact individual dispersal decisions, and in particular favor staying home, and a lot of animals staying home and breeding in their female kin groups. And we can start to look at not only how that shapes group structure, but some of the consequences of whether you live alone or in a group. So does that make sense so far? And again, I keep hammering this, but all of this is based on these really simple, just knowing who's who and following the soap opera of their lives. All right. Well, that right there would be, what do I want to say, would be enough to fulfill a lot of careers or a lot of long-term projects looking at social behavior. But things are changing, and I feel like now I have a sales pitch. But wait, there's more. All the stuff I've described thus far is classic behavioral ecology, classic field-based studies of animal behavior. Increasingly, though, behavioral biologists are trying to pair that type of information with information about things like genetic variation, maybe hormone levels to understand what's going on physiologically in an animal, and increasingly differences in gene expression, right? That we all have the same DNA sequence in us, the same set of genes and alleles throughout our lifetime. But how active those genes are and how the extent to which they're expressed can change very quickly, often in response to environmental changes, and increasingly we're realizing that shapes behavior. And so as part of answer your question, that's another factor we're looking at with regard to dispersal. So increasingly, the classic field behavioral biology is being coupled with these types of analyses. The catch, or the extra step here, is that we can't get the relevant data to do these types of analyses just by watching individuals. We need something else. We need some tissue or some substance to be able to analyze. So this leads me to secret number 4, which is how to non-invasively sample animals, right? Because again, we want them alive and healthy and happy and running around. So how can we collect the materials we need to do all these other types of analyses? Now, I confess, I'm still waiting for the tricorder, okay? We've been waiting since the 60s. It's not here yet, but I'm holding out, okay? But in lieu of that option, there are a number of other things we can use to, again, look at genetic patterns, look at hormonal patterns, things like that. Non-invasive sampling, for example, saliva is one option. And increasingly, field studies were getting animals to spit at us, okay, one way or another. Some do it naturally. Camelids, wild llamas, things like that, they spit pretty readily. Others not so much. So increasingly what field studies are doing is, for example, this kinkajou here has been given this piece of plastic coated with fruit, something it wants to eat. It's going to chew on the piece of plastic, get the fruit off, but then leave saliva behind, and the researchers can pick up the plastic tube and then use the saliva both to look at genetics and look at hormones. Same idea here with this monkey. Shout out here, this is Erin, who again is sitting right here, playing tug of war with a spotted hyena cub. That was a job she had for a while. She can tell you more about it afterwards, but again, basically to collect hyena saliva to look at hormone levels. So, trying again this non-invasive sampling, which is increasingly important. Saliva is one option. Any thoughts about what another option would be? Julie, keep quiet. Yeah.
Hair.
I like the trend here. Hair, yes. I didn't include a hair slide, but you're right. Hair is very valuable. I went for the poop, and I'm really happy that one popped up despite it being a dinner talk, right? Turns out poop is super useful, and for a lot of animals, relatively easy to collect. I don't personally have a collecting box like this. I know people who do, but you get the idea. All right. And in fact, poop has become such a big deal for non-invasive sampling. I love this example too. You may have heard about this dog, I think its name is Eba or Elba, who's been trained to sniff whale poop. And so the dog rides around on the prow of boats in the Pacific Northwest, scenting whale poop. And then, the researchers, when the dog points on it, the researchers can go scoop up the floating whale poop and do the same types of analyses. So I really like that because we're exploiting one species to sample another, but it works. I think you get the idea. With tuco-tucos, poop is a great resource. They poop pretty readily, and so we've used that as a source of non-invasive sample to look at, in particular, things related to hormone levels, kind of, again, building on our theme about costs and benefits of sociality. So a little bit about the background on that. As we're sitting here thinking about these lone females breeding alone versus females breeding in groups, things like that, we started to think about, okay, the real world's challenging. Animals are probably stressed all the time, but some of that stress comes from physical challenges, things like getting food, avoiding predators. Some of that stress comes from interacting with conspecifics. And again, human experience, we can all understand that, right? Interacting with fellow humans can be stressful at times. What's that balance for colonial tuco-tuco? And in particular, does it differ between those lone females and the females in groups? And we decided to measure that by looking at glucocorticoid hormones. If you don't know what those are, you can think of them as stress hormones. They provide a good measure of physiological stress. Glucocorticoid hormones come in several varieties. There's baseline, which is kind of your everyday operating level of stress. And so if I'm a really just generally wired type A person, I probably have higher baseline glucocorticoids than some of my more relaxed graduate students. Although graduate students are supposed to be stressed, right? We need to do so. Yeah, okay. So baseline, I heard that, Lawrence. There's also acute measures of glucocorticoids or acute changes in glucocorticoids, those immediate kind of fight or flight responses, such as when a predator comes for you. And then there's also chronic, when the conditions are so bad and have been so bad for a long time, stress levels, your glucocorticoid levels are so high, they're starting to have negative impacts on other aspects of your biology. We decided to focus on baseline and to compare baseline glucocorticoid levels for our females that dispersed and were breeding alone versus the females that had stayed home and were living in a group. As I said, tucos poop readily. We could collect fecal pellets, dry them out, grind them up, and then analyze them in the lab. And here's what we found. Turns out, yep, those lone females are more stressed out than the females living in groups. I love this story because the bottom line, you could say single moms are more stressed out. I love this because Julie, who's here, and again, it's great she's here, was a non-traditional student who came back to graduate school as a single mom with 4 kids. This is her doctoral dissertation, or a big part of her doctoral dissertation. And I think she could really resonate with that outcome. But yes, single moms are more stressed out. And at first that might seem, think about it, but the more we thought about it, that kind of made sense because they have to do everything on their own, right? They have to dig the burrow on their own. They have to get the food on their own, watch out for predators, all of those things going on. And what the data suggests is those stressors are more significant than the social stressors of hanging out with some of your female relatives. All right. An example then of how we can use these non-invasive samples to kind of augment or add another dimension to our understanding of what it means to be social or live alone versus in a group in these animals. So bottom line, kind of then wrapping up on our field studies, who you live with matters. In particular, whether you live with anyone matters. So if you're colonial tuco-tuco, living in that female kin group affects your reproduction, your survival, your stress physiology, and no doubt other things that we haven't yet looked at. Pretty cool. Question, yeah. Yeah.
In the group situation, are there males in there or it's only females?
The males, boy, that's a whole other story. Yes, I'm laughing only because the punchline again is it's tough to be a male. Males move in for the breeding season. Again, they're coming in from somewhere else. More than one male may show up at the same burrow system so that they fight. So there's competition going on. It can often result in males getting pretty beat up. Obviously, there's a male there to sire offspring, right? But then even by the time we're in the field, about a month after all that's happening, a lot of these systems are already lacking males, and every implication is they just haven't survived. The combination of the fighting, the wounds, the physical, they burn out, and that's it. And so, yeah.
So in the burrow is all females, and the other burrow is single female, no males in that one.
Right. Some of them, the male is still there, but quite a few burrows he's already moved on. So again, the comparison we're focusing on are the females and whether there are other females present or not. Yeah. Thanks.
Could I ask a question?
Yeah. Sorry, it's hard to see.
No, that's okay. I'm way back here in the dark. I was wondering about you said in the burrows with the single female that there were more offspring than the others. How do those offspring fare if they lose their mama and then I just wondered, or have you studied that? Maybe that's down the road.
So how do they fare? And I guess I could answer that a couple ways. And obviously, if the adult female dies or is killed, and these guys are small rodents, so they're food for a lot of things, it depends on how old the offspring are. Tuco-tucos are very precocial, meaning that when they're born, they're already furry, their eyes are open, they start wandering around almost right away. So it doesn't take too long before they could survive on their own if mom happened to die. But there is a window of several weeks there where she's pretty important. And so obviously if it's a lone female, something happens to mom and the pups are young, that's not good news. It's a great question. I have not actually compared, I kind of want to call it like extinction rate for groups, lone females versus whole groups, but I would bet lone females are more likely to wink out like that. Yeah. Did that answer the question? Was that what you...
Yeah, that's where I was at. I was just wondering if it was an area to study. Because you think about, I'm sorry, I'm making comparisons between these two, and stuff I heard can be on.
No, and it's a great question.
Anyway, thank you.
Because, yeah, it probably is there's a bigger risk if you're a lone female, right? If something happens to you, that's it. Yeah. No, these are all great questions, and there is no bad question here, right? So, okay, hopefully I've convinced you that, again, with relatively simple techniques, we can actually learn a lot about wild populations of animals. Now I'm going to let you in on the last secret for tonight, and that is there's still a lot of species to study, okay? So I've been telling you about the colonial tuco-tuco, and I explained I started studying that species because there were these hints that it was doing something interesting. I also told you there are a lot of other species of tuco-tucos. So over time, we've been slowly adding to the picture, and we're now up to 9 different species that we've studied, same methods, and finding a lot of variation. And again, this is a genus of animals. The dogma was they're all solitary. except maybe one exception. And we're finding all kinds of variation. That what this indicates, the map is relatively straightforward, showing you the different localities where we've studied these different species. The color coding here, green is solitary, and yes, there are some species that really are solitary, ranging up through yellow, orange, red. The most social is the colonial tuco-tuco, the one I've been telling you about. But increasingly, we're finding other variants in between those extremes, in between being solitary and being as social as the colonial tuco-tuco. Lots of tucos still to go. This is my retirement plan. Is I'll just drive up and down the Andes studying different tuco-tucos. But to be honest, I love that. I love discovering what these different animals are doing and piecing them into this larger comparative picture. What are we going to discover? Maybe this is partly where some of that dispersal question falls. We don't know yet. Okay? So that's the maybe final secret, the top secret part. We don't know what we're going to end up with in the long run. So with that, I think I'll close. Thank you. Acknowledge the different people who've helped over the years. And happy to take questions. Tucker, yeah.
You teased us early on with that provocative photo from the Dynasty soap opera.
Oh, yes.
Which showed apparently a rather lucky man surrounded by 5 or 6 women.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Does the male tuco-tuco ever hang out, remain in the perhaps female-dominant, many female burrow?
He will as long as he can, meaning as long as he can stay alive, right? It's more a question of how long he's going to survive. The colonial tuco-tuco that I was telling you about, it's never more than one male per group of females. If more than one shows up, they fight. But interestingly, one of the variations we're finding, several of these orange-colored species, there are multiple males living together in the same group, and they last longer. And so that's one of the differences we're starting to find. So again, that colonial species is kind of extreme, right? Males seem to come in, don't last long, and every season it's a different male who's in there reproducing. But that's not the pattern for all of these species, yeah. I'll add one interesting tidbit to that. So I mentioned I've got a captive colony of colonial tuco-tucos over on the Berkeley campus, which has allowed us to look at a lot of things that we can't see in the field, because now we can put them in plastic burrow systems and watch what they're doing. Even in the lab, so no predators, the food's the same, all animals are cared for the same. Males at about 18 months of age, which corresponds to about the age in the field when they would have now bred for the first time and the pups are growing up, they just start keeling over. They're fine one day and the next day they're dead. Whereas females easily live 2-3 years. So everything suggests that, in the field, I suspect it's a combination of fighting, getting beat up, and being killed by predators, but that the senescence patterns as a result are different for males and females. And, males in the field are never going to live more than 18 months, and so there's been no selection for all the physiological mechanisms that would keep them going longer than that. But that's kind of surprising, right? And disconcerting at first. It's like, what's happening? But it just, yeah. So. You look dismayed by that, Tucker. Was that a difficult revelation?
18 months, mate, and die?
Yep. Suddenly, don't you feel a whole lot better as a human? I mean, yeah, of course.
Who digs the tunnels?
Who digs the tunnel? Everybody. So everybody contributes to excavating and modifying the burrows. If you go out early on a still morning, everybody's digging. Dirt's flying everywhere. If it's a windy day, they don't like to dig so much, and I think partly because it's harder to detect predators when the wind's blowing. But on a still morning, everyone's out digging.
So males and females?
Males and females, yes. The interesting thing is it's very rare that they just dig a burrow system de novo. That all the years I've been going down, I have never seen them just create a burrow system. They're always modifying what's there, but you kind of wonder, like a chicken and egg thing, how did it all get started? But yeah, but no, both males and females participate in the digging. Yeah.
What predisposes a female to have her own family and not to be a part of the groups, and will she do it the following year? Or might she join the group some years and some years not?
Oh, okay. So an individual female, as far as we can tell, that decision when she's about 4 months old is a pretty critical and irrevocable one. That if she's going to disperse, that's the only time in her life she'll disperse. That once a female is an adult, 1 year old, and producing her own offspring, she'll spend the rest of her life wherever she is at that point. They don't continue moving around. So a female who disperses and lives alone, she'll accumulate daughters after that and end up in a group, but it's not because she's moving and joining another group. In contrast, the females that stay home, I mean, they're in the group right away, but they'll stay again in that exact same burrow system, and the group is composed of those same females and their daughters and things like that. So it really is a matriarchy. It really is built around females. That's another difference we're finding. Some of these other species, particularly the ones in orange, are not as group faithful. And females will move around year to year and live, over here with this set of animals 1 year and somewhere else the next year. So again, it's really the species I've been focusing on is the most extreme. Did that answer your question?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Question, yeah.
I was wondering how much of this is all instinctual behavior versus, say, learned behavior?
Wow. I'm not saying, it's a hard question to answer for a couple of reasons. One is, how would you know where to draw that line, right? That's something behavioral biologists have debated for centuries. And I think most of us would suggest it's a mix of both. So thinking about maybe that dispersal question that we've been talking a lot about, if I had to, I would say at some level it's probably instinctual, or what we might use the word innate, meaning it's not that a female is sitting there with a calculator estimating, I weigh that at some level it's inherent to her behavior and her phenotype. But at the same time, there probably may not be quite learned, but an environmental component that varies, thinking about, if I'm the only female among all the juveniles versus I'm in a group where there's 10 juvenile females, that might influence a decision as well, right? And that's not necessarily learned, but it's a little bit more dependent on the immediate environment. And I'm sure you could all predict what you would expect to happen. If I'm the only female, might as well stay home. If there are 10 of us, there's no way we're all going to be able to fit in that burrow system and live there. So somebody's got to go, and then it's a question of who. Yeah. Did that answer your question? Yeah. Okay. Sorry, it's a hard one to answer exactly, and I think we usually tend to view, anything as a mix of both. I mean, what is innate, right? But something that is not experiential, not based on experience and experience, or
Yeah, it's just if you were to say transplant an animal to another location or a group of them, would they essentially sort of develop the same behavior pattern?
Excellent question. That's a great experiment. My prediction would be that initially, at least, they would tend to behave somewhat similarly. And the reason I say that is I'm expecting over evolutionary time, selection has tuned their behavior to what it is now, right? Based on the environment they've been in, has tuned them to this pattern, for example, of dispersing, not dispersing. And so immediately, some of that may be kind of, what word I want to use, locked in, hardwired, things like that. But over time, those patterns could start to change. Does that make sense? It's not like an either or, it's some mix. But my prediction would be, it'd be amazing to run that experiment, is that early on the behavior would be pretty similar, but over time might start to drift and you would see other patterns developing. Yeah. There's a question over here, yeah.
I think you mentioned that if two males entered the burrow at the same time in pursuit of a female, it's not uncommon to see them fight.
Yeah.
Is it at all common for two females to fight?
Not so much. Both in the field, I can't remember ever finding evidence of females injured when we catch them. The males at the right time of the year, if you catch two together in the same burrow system, they've usually ripped each other up pretty well. Never seen that in females. In the lab, we can't house males together once they're more than a few months old because they'll fight. Females, we can almost, this is a little bit of an overstatement, but any two females together and they're they're fine with each other. Not 100% true, but it's rare that you can't just like put two females together and have them be okay with each other. Yeah. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah.
Is there some critters that normally go into the burrow to kill of any age, and are they? I would think that males would be useful to be the guard puppy.
You would think. So that's an interesting question too. There definitely are predators, but they're all outside the burrows. That raptors, owls, foxes, but they're all. No, there are no snakes in this area. It's just too cold, too far south. The one potential mustelid weasel-like predator that used to exist has been extirpated. So it was a big animal. It was more like Wujin is the Argentine term I'm trying to come up with. It wasn't like our little weasels that could easily go down a burrow, maybe more like a badger. Whether it preyed on them or not, we don't know. But currently, all the danger's at the surface and outside the burrows. Yeah, yeah. Is there another question? Did I miss? Sorry. Oh, sorry. Yeah, it's hard to see them.
So you have all these females, either a single one, and what happens to the males? I mean, how do they get out, and how many female offspring are there to male offspring?
So the sex ratio at birth is 1-to-1, so equal number of males and females. And that seems to hold as long as, all those young animals are living together. At the adult level, though, it's very female biased. The sex ratio among adults is something like 5 females per male. So something's happening between when they're all juveniles living together with their family and that first breeding season as adults. And again, every implication is that males just they die. That, first all of them are dispersing. Dispersing's dangerous. You have to run above the ground, so you're at risk there. These guys don't run very well. So that's one thing males are doing that not all females are doing. The competition, the fighting, that takes a toll as well. And so every suggestion is it's just tough to be a male. And so you start out with equal numbers, but that extra male mortality, by the time they're ready to breed, you've now killed off a lot of the males and have a really biased sex ratio. Yeah. Yeah. Question, yeah.
When they pop up to the top to feed on the grass, do they just go near the burrow? They have to run to get grass, right?
No, they don't. They pop up, they open a hole from underground, pop up, they'll come out usually only about that far. They create like a little crop circle around the burrow entrance, and once they're done, then they'll move on and open the next one. And so to walk through that field where we work, it looks like a little putting green where there are all these holes that have been clear cut right around the hole to half a body length, and they're just in a line. They're not very creative, right? So they finish this hole and they'll move 6 inches, and so you can kind of follow the line of how they've been progressing.
So in the one where there's the community, they all just take turns popping up?
No, they'll have more than one hole for the group, right? Yeah, and so it's not just one hole where everybody's, although multiple animals will use each hole. And when we're trapping, if we pick the right hole, you can just keep catching them there. I feel like I'm not answering your question very well, but...
Well, the second part of my question was, when one comes up, does she bring food back for the others?
Yeah. Okay. In particular, when they're young pups around, those females, they just go on these like foraging jags where they'll just grab food, pull it in, they'll just keep doing that over and over. We don't usually disturb their tunnels again because we don't want to disturb them too much, but when we have occasionally, you find little piles of the vegetation they've pulled in, and certainly again watching in the lab, if the mom does that, then the pups are all right behind her and they just start grabbing the food, but she's the one out there taking the risk. Yeah.
My follow-up would be, so in the group female situation, does some females tend to pop up more and they bring it back, and with those, the ones that pop up more, were those the ones that would disperse more likely?
As far as we can tell, it's pretty equitable. There's not yet, okay, so I was really happy to find these guys are social, but they're no naked mole rat, I'll tell you that. And it's not just because they're furry, they're just not that complicated. As far as we can tell, everybody's just doing the same thing, and the benefit of the group is that there are more females doing it with fewer pups to take care of.
If
Yeah.
it's a braver one, would that one tend to disperse more?
Well, that's another excellent
That's what I was
question.
getting.
And that's what I was doing today before I came over here, is we run them through a little series of behavioral tests in the lab to try and identify who the bold ones are and who's not. And so, absolutely, you should come work in my lab. You're asking all the right questions. We'll put you to work.
With pigeons,
Okay.
reinforcement conditioning.
Oh yeah. So no, we can definitely put you to work. Yeah. Other question? Yeah.
So I got two different impressions, and I just wanted to
Sure.
clarify.
Yeah.
You have multiple burrows, and are they connected by a tunnel underground, or are they? How are they actually connected? And because in one case you said that they hop from one burrow to another, and they go up on the surface, and they go into another one, and so how does that configuration work?
And again, there's no simple answer. So let's define, like, here's a burrow system, right? In 1 year, where it's all one continuous burrow system, meaning one group occupying all of that area. Come back a year later, and it may now be subdivided. The contour is the same, but there's a group living on this side and a group living on this side. And as far as we can tell, using the radio telemetry, they never mix. So even though it physically was connected at one point, they seem to have walled it off. So there's a lot of dynamic going on there. That's all kind of one spot. Now let's say there's another burrow system over here. Depending on how far that is, but it's pretty common that if I was going to move from here to there, yes, I would have to come up on the surface and run down and cross over that way. That it's not, the area we work in is not just one huge burrow system. That either Does that help answer it? As you're figuring out with these animals, nothing is straightforward, right? Everything is, well, it's a mix of, so, yeah.